What happened that night in the nursing home would haunt everyone who heard it forever. An 87-year-old woman's confession about switching two babies 50 years ago was about to destroy multiple lives and reveal a truth that should have stayed buried. Dorothy Mitchell sat in her favorite chair by the window at Willow Creek Nursing Home, her weathered hands trembling as she held an old photograph. At 87 years old, she had kept a secret for over 5 decades that was eating her alive from the inside. Every night at exactly 3:15 a.m., the same time the incident happened 50 years ago, she would wake up in cold sweat, remembering what she had done. The guilt had become unbearable, and she knew she had to confess before it was too late. Before we continue with Dorothy's shocking revelation, if you want to hear more incredible true stories from nursing homes that will leave you speechless, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These stories need to be heard. Sarah Johnson, a 23-year-old nurse who had just started her night shift at the nursing home, was making her rounds when she heard soft sobbing coming from Dorothy's room. The young nurse had only been working there for 2 weeks, fresh out of nursing school, eager to make a difference in the lives of the elderly residents. She gently knocked on Dorothy's door and found the older woman clutching a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1968 with the headline, "Hospital Baby Mix-Up Allegations. Two Families File Lawsuit." Dorothy looked up at Sarah with tear-filled eyes and whispered words that would change everything. She said she couldn't carry this burden anymore, that she needed to tell someone the truth before she died. Sarah sat down beside her, not knowing that what she was about to hear would shake her to her core and make her question everything about right and wrong. The old woman began her story, taking Sarah back to November 1968 at Chicago Presbyterian Hospital, where Dorothy had worked as the head nurse in the maternity ward. She was respected, trusted, and had delivered hundreds of babies over her career. But that particular night was different. Two baby boys were born within minutes of each other. One belonged to the wealthy Harris family, old money from Chicago's Gold Coast, people who had everything except warmth and love. The other belonged to Maria and Jose Rodriguez, immigrants from Mexico, who worked multiple jobs just to make ends meet, but whose hearts were full of love and dreams for their newborn son. Dorothy explained how she had watched both families during the pregnancy. The Harris family, particularly the mother Barbara, seemed cold and detached, more concerned about how the baby would affect their social calendar than about the miracle of new life. They had hired 3 nannies before the baby was even born, and made it clear that the child would be raised by staff. Mr. Harris had actually complained about having to leave his golf tournament for the delivery. On the other hand, the Rodriguez family had decorated their tiny apartment's corner with handmade baby items, and Jose had worked extra shifts for months to buy a second-hand crib. Maria had knitted tiny booties and sewn little outfits with such love that Dorothy had been moved to tears watching them. What Dorothy did next would haunt her for the rest of her life. In a moment of what she thought was compassion, but was actually playing God, she switched the babies. The wealthy Harris family's biological son went home with the Rodriguez family, and the Rodriguez baby went home with the Harrises. She had convinced herself she was doing the right thing, giving each child what she thought they needed. One would have love, but not money. The other would have money, but not love. She thought she was balancing the scales of justice, but she was actually committing an unforgivable crime. But the real shock was still coming, and Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Dorothy continued, explaining how she had falsified the records, switching the ankle bands when no one was looking. She was the head nurse, so no one questioned her. The other nurses trusted her completely. She had been so careful, so methodical, but within days, she realized the magnitude of what she had done. The Rodriguez family had named their son Pedro, showering him with love, despite their poverty. The Harris family named theirs Michael, immediately handing him over to the nannies. Dorothy wanted to confess right away, but the fear of losing her license, going to prison, and destroying both families kept her silent. Years passed, and Dorothy secretly kept track of both boys. What happened next proved that her intervention had been meaningless, even cruel. Michael Harris, who was actually the biological son of the Rodriguez family, grew up to become exactly what the Harris family wanted, a cold, ruthless businessman who now ran one of the largest corporations in Chicago. He had inherited his adoptive father's lack of empathy and his adoptive mother's emotional distance. Despite having all the advantages money could buy, the best schools, the finest tutors, he had turned out exactly like the family that raised him, not the one that bore him. Meanwhile, Pedro Rodriguez, the biological Harris child, raised by the immigrant family, had become everything the Rodriguez family had hoped for. A warm, caring man who worked as a community organizer, married his high school sweetheart, and had 3 children of his own. Despite growing up with very little money, he was rich in all the ways that mattered. He volunteered at soup kitchens, coached Little League, and was known throughout his neighborhood as someone who would give you the shirt off his back. What she discovered about their current situation made everything even more tragic. Dorothy revealed to Sarah that both men were now connected to the nursing home in ways that made her secret even more unbearable. Michael Harris visited monthly to see his adoptive mother Barbara, who was now a resident in room 205, suffering from dementia. He would sit stiffly beside her bed for exactly 30 minutes, checking his phone constantly, clearly there out of obligation rather than love. Barbara would sometimes look at him with confusion, as if she knew something was wrong but couldn't place it. And Pedro Rodriguez, in a twist of fate that seemed almost supernatural, worked at the very same nursing home as a janitor and maintenance supervisor. Every single day, Pedro walked past room 205, past his biological mother, Barbara Harris, without knowing the truth. Sometimes Barbara would call out to him, reaching her frail hands toward him, calling him my boy or son, but everyone assumed it was just the dementia talking. Pedro would always stop and be kind to her, holding her hand, talking gently to her, showing her more genuine care in those brief moments than Michael ever did in his obligatory monthly visits. The irony was heartbreaking. The son who was raised by the Harris family couldn't stand to be near the woman he thought was his mother, while the son who was raised by the Rodriguez family showed natural affection to the woman who actually was his biological mother. That's when Dorothy pulled out the envelope that would change everything. Inside were 2 DNA test results that Dorothy had secretly obtained just a month ago. She had been planning this for years, but had only recently gotten the courage to go through with it. Getting the DNA samples had been surprisingly easy. Michael always left his coffee cup in Barbara's room, and Pedro often ate lunch in the staff break room. A few hair samples, a specialized home DNA kit ordered online, and within weeks, she had scientific proof of what she had done 50 years ago. The results were undeniable. Michael Harris shared no DNA with Barbara Harris, and Pedro Rodriguez was her biological son. Sarah stared at the papers in disbelief, asking Dorothy what she planned to do with this information. The old woman's response revealed another shocking layer to this already incredible story. Dorothy explained that there was more at stake than just the truth. Barbara Harris, despite her dementia, had moments of clarity where she had confided in Dorothy that she had always felt something was wrong with Michael. She said he never felt like her son, that there was no connection, no bond, despite her trying to convince herself otherwise for 50 years. She had blamed herself, thinking she was a terrible mother, when in reality, her maternal instincts had been right all along. Meanwhile, Maria Rodriguez had passed away 10 years ago, but before she died, She had told Pedro stories about the night he was born. She mentioned a kind nurse named Dorothy, who had been so helpful, who had seemed so invested in their family. Maria had always said Pedro was her miracle baby, that God had blessed them specially. Jose Rodriguez was still alive, living in a small apartment in Chicago, and Pedro visited him every week. The old man, now 89, often told Pedro how proud he was, how Pedro had exceeded all his dreams, how he was the best thing that had ever happened to their family. When the lawyer knocked on Dorothy's door the next morning, everything was about to unravel in ways no one expected. Dorothy had decided to contact a lawyer to figure out how to reveal the truth without destroying everyone's lives. But the lawyer, a young woman named Jennifer Clark, had immediately recognized the legal ramifications. This wasn't just about emotional damage. There were massive financial implications. Michael Harris had inherited hundreds of millions of dollars from the Harris family fortune. If he wasn't their biological son, Pedro Rodriguez might have a claim to that inheritance. The Harris family company, Harris Industries, was a publicly traded corporation worth billions. The scandal could destroy stock prices, trigger lawsuits, and ruin countless lives. Jennifer had also pointed out that Dorothy could face criminal charges, even 50 years later. While the statute of limitations might protect her from some charges, fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy charges could still apply. At 87, Dorothy could spend her final years in prison. But Dorothy said she didn't care about herself anymore. She just wanted the truth to come out. She had already written letters to both Michael and Pedro, explaining everything, begging for their forgiveness, though she knew she didn't deserve it. What happened when Pedro found out the truth was something no one saw coming. Sarah had convinced Dorothy to wait, to think about it more before sending the letters. But fate had other plans. The very next day, Pedro was fixing a leaky pipe in Dorothy's room. When he noticed the DNA test results on her dresser, he picked them up, initially thinking they were medical tests for Dorothy. But then he saw his name and Michael Harris's name. His hands shook as he read the results. The scientific proof that his entire life had been built on a lie. Dorothy walked in to find Pedro sitting on her bed, tears streaming down his face, the papers crumpled in his strong, work-worn hands. The conversation that followed was one of the most emotional moments Sarah had ever witnessed. Pedro wasn't angry, which surprised everyone. Instead, he was devastated for his parents, for Maria and Jose, who had loved him so completely, who had sacrificed everything for him. He kept saying they were his real parents, that DNA didn't matter, that love was what made a family. But he also couldn't deny the pull he had always felt toward Barbara Harris, the way he had always felt compelled to stop and talk to her, to comfort her, even when he had dozens of other residents to attend to. Dorothy tried to explain her reasoning from 50 years ago, but even she knew how hollow it sounded now. She had thought she was giving each baby a better life, but she had no right to make that choice. Pedro asked her the question that had been haunting Dorothy for decades. Who gave you the right to play God with our lives? Dorothy had no answer. There was no answer. What she had done was unforgivable, no matter her intentions. Little did anyone know, Michael Harris had been suspicious for years about his identity. Sarah learned that Michael had hired a private investigator 3 years ago to look into his birth after a routine medical test had revealed he had type O blood, while both his parents had type AB, making it genetically impossible for them to be his biological parents. The investigator had hit dead ends, but Michael had never stopped wondering. When he received Dorothy's letter, hand-delivered by Jennifer the lawyer, everything finally made sense. His reaction was completely different from Pedro's. Michael immediately saw opportunity, where Pedro saw tragedy. He contacted his team of lawyers to explore his options. Could he sue the hospital? Could he claim damages from Dorothy's estate? Could he somehow leverage this information for his benefit, but most surprisingly, he wanted to meet his biological parents, not out of love or curiosity about his roots, but because he was fascinated by the idea that he had succeeded despite coming from nothing. In his mind, it proved his superiority, that nature had trumped nurture, that he was destined for greatness regardless of his circumstances. The meeting between the two men, who had lived each other's lives, was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Pedro insisted it happen in Barbara's room, so she could be part of it, even if she might not understand. Michael agreed, though he seemed more interested in studying Pedro like a science experiment than connecting with a brother. Dorothy would be there too, to face the consequences of her actions. Sarah was asked to be present as a witness, and for medical support, as the emotional stress could be dangerous for both Dorothy and Barbara. The truth about what really happened in the hospital that night, 50 years ago, was even darker than Dorothy had admitted. As the meeting approached, Dorothy made one more confession to Sarah. She revealed that there had been a third baby born that night, a baby girl who had been stillborn. The mother, a young woman named Catherine Walsh, had been devastated. Dorothy had held her as she cried, promising to take care of everything. But the paperwork had gotten mixed up in the chaos of switching the boys, and Catherine's records had been altered to show she had never been pregnant at all. Catherine had spent years thinking she had imagined her pregnancy, had been institutionalized for insisting she had given birth, and had eventually taken her own life. Dorothy had carried this additional guilt, knowing that her crime had caused ripples of damage she never anticipated. The morning of the meeting arrived with unexpected revelations. Barbara Harris had woken up, having one of her rare lucid moments. She recognized Michael when he walked in, but immediately said, "You're not my son." Everyone froze. She looked at Pedro, who was standing nervously by the door in his janitor uniform, and her eyes filled with tears. "There you are," she whispered. "I've been waiting for you." It was as if some deep maternal instinct had always known, had always been trying to break through the fog of confusion and dementia. Michael watched this reunion with clinical detachment, taking notes on his phone, already calculating how this would affect his business dealings. Pedro, meanwhile, was overwhelmed with emotion, kneeling beside Barbara's bed, holding her fragile hand as she stroked his face with wonder. Dorothy watched from her wheelchair, the weight of her sin finally crushing her completely. She had thought she was giving each child what they needed, but she had only caused pain and confusion that rippled through generations. When Pedro's father, Jose, arrived, everything reached a breaking point that would determine everyone's future. Sarah had called Jose at Pedro's request, and the 89-year-old man arrived confused but determined to support his son. When Pedro explained everything, showing him the DNA results, Jose's reaction surprised everyone. The old man stood up, walked over to Dorothy, and did something no one expected. He forgave her. In broken English, mixed with Spanish, he said that Pedro was his son in every way that mattered, that Dorothy's crime had given him the greatest gift of his life, and that holding on to anger would only poison what time they had left. But Michael's reaction to meeting Jose was cruel and dismissive. He looked at the man who should have been his father with disdain, making comments about how lucky he was to have escaped such poverty. Pedro stood up to defend Jose, and for the first time the two men who had lived each other's lives faced off. Pedro told Michael that he was the lucky one, that he had grown up with love, with values, with parents who showed him what really mattered in life. Michael laughed, saying money was what mattered, that power was what mattered, that Pedro was naive and foolish. The confrontation escalated when Michael announced his plans. He intended to go public with the story, to sue the hospital, to write a book, to turn this tragedy into profit. He had already contacted media outlets, and reporters were waiting outside the nursing home. Pedro begged him not to, saying it would destroy their elderly fathers, that Jose's heart couldn't take the stress, that the Harris family reputation would be ruined. But Michael didn't care. He saw only opportunity where others saw tragedy. But Dorothy had one more secret that changed everything. She revealed that she had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 3 months ago. She had maybe weeks left to live. This confession wasn't just about clearing her conscience. It was about legal protection for Pedro and Jose. She had already signed documents, taking full legal responsibility for the switch, ensuring that no blame could fall on the hospitals or the families. She had liquidated her entire estate, what little she had, and placed it in trust for Pedro's children's education. She knew it couldn't make up for what she had done, but she wanted to do something, anything, to make amends. Michael's lawyers had arrived and were setting up in the nursing home's conference room. They had drawn up papers for Pedro to sign, relinquishing any claim to the Harris fortune in exchange for a small settlement. But Pedro shocked everyone by refusing to sign anything. He didn't want the Harris money, but he also wouldn't let Michael profit from this tragedy. He announced that if Michael went public, he would too, but his version would focus on how love and family had triumphed over wealth and privilege, how he was proud to be a Rodriguez, how his parents had given him something worth more than all the Harris millions. The media frenzy outside was growing, but then something unexpected happened inside Barbara's room. Barbara, still in her moment of clarity, asked to speak. Her voice was weak but clear. She said she had always known something was wrong, had always felt disconnected from Michael, had blamed herself for being a cold mother. But now she understood it wasn't her fault. She looked at Michael and said words that would haunt him forever. "I tried to love you, but you wouldn't let me. Now I know why. You were never mine to love." Then she turned to Pedro and said, "But you were always kind to me, even when you didn't know. You have your father's eyes, his kindness. I'm proud that you're my son, even if I never got to raise you." Michael stood up to leave, but Dorothy's next words stopped him cold. She told him that she had one more piece of information. The Harris family fortune, the one he had inherited, had a moral clause in the original trust. If any heir was found to have obtained the inheritance through fraud or deception, even unknowingly, the entire fortune would go to charity. Dorothy had found this out through her lawyer Jennifer. If Michael pursued this publicly, he could lose everything. The fortune he had built his entire identity around could vanish overnight. The silence in the room was deafening. Michael's lawyers were frantically making phone calls, verifying this information. Pedro sat holding Barbara's hand while Jose stood behind him, a protective hand on his shoulder. Dorothy watched from her wheelchair, knowing that this final revelation might be the only thing that could protect the families from complete destruction. Sarah stood in the corner, witnessing this incredible moment where 50 years of deception was finally coming to light. What Michael decided to do next would determine the fate of everyone in that room. After a long silence, Michael made his decision. He would keep quiet, but not out of kindness or consideration for others. He would keep quiet to protect his fortune, his reputation, his business empire. He looked at Pedro with contempt and said, "Keep your poverty and your precious family values. I'll keep my millions." He turned to Barbara, who had already slipped back into confusion, and said coldly, "I'll continue the monthly visits until you die. It's what's expected." Then he walked out, his lawyers scrambling to follow. Pedro stayed with Barbara for hours that day, talking to her, even though she no longer recognized him. Jose sat with them, and Dorothy watched from across the room, tears streaming down her face. Sarah witnessed something beautiful in that moment. A family coming together, not because of blood, but because of choice. Pedro chose to care for Barbara, not because she was his biological mother, but because it was the right thing to do. Jose chose to accept the truth with grace, because his love for Pedro transcended DNA. Over the following weeks, a new routine developed. Pedro would visit Barbara every day during his breaks, not as her janitor, but as her son. Jose would come on weekends, bringing homemade Mexican food that Barbara seemed to enjoy even in her confusion. Michael continued his obligatory monthly visits, but they became even shorter, more perfunctory. Dorothy watched it all from her room, growing weaker by the day, but finding some small peace in seeing Pedro and Barbara together. The nursing home staff began to notice the change. Barbara seemed calmer, more content. She would light up when Pedro entered the room, even if she didn't know exactly who he was. Pedro had told his wife and children the truth, and they had embraced Barbara as family, visiting her and calling her grandma. The Rodriguez family had expanded to include this elderly woman who had never gotten to raise her biological son, but was now surrounded by the love she had always craved. Dorothy's health deteriorated rapidly, but she had one more thing she needed to do. She asked Sarah to arrange a meeting with Catherine Walsh's surviving family. Catherine, the woman whose baby had been stillborn that night 50 years ago, had a sister who was still alive. Dorothy needed to confess this final piece of her crime, to tell them that Catherine hadn't been crazy, that she had indeed given birth, that the hospital records had been altered in Dorothy's attempt to cover up the baby switch. The meeting was heartbreaking, but it brought closure to a family that had spent decades wondering what had really happened. As Dorothy lay dying, she asked for Pedro's forgiveness one last time. Pedro held her hand and told her something profound. He said that while he couldn't forgive her for the choice she stole from his parents, he could thank her for the life he had lived. He had been loved completely by Maria and Jose, had grown up with values that money couldn't buy, had become a man his parents were proud of. If he had grown up as Michael Harris, he might have become like Michael, cold, calculating, empty, despite all his wealth. In a strange way, Dorothy's terrible decision had given him a beautiful life. Dorothy died peacefully. 3 days later, with Sarah by her side, her funeral was small, attended only by Sarah, Pedro, Jose, and surprisingly, Barbara, who had another moment of clarity and insisted on going. Michael didn't attend, but he did send flowers with a card that simply said, "The truth dies with you." But he was wrong. The truth lived on, in the kindness Pedro showed to Barbara, in the love Jose had for his son, in the way the Rodriguez family had opened their hearts to include Barbara in whatever time she had left. Sarah continued to work at the nursing home, but the experience had changed her profoundly. She had learned that family wasn't just about blood, that love could transcend terrible betrayals, that forgiveness was possible, even for the most unforgivable acts. She would sometimes see Pedro with Barbara, singing to her in Spanish, holding her hand, being the son she had always needed, and she would think about Dorothy's confession, about the weight of secrets, about the power of truth. 6 months later, Barbara Harris passed away peacefully with Pedro by her side. She had spent her final months surrounded by more love than she had experienced in decades. Michael handled the funeral arrangements efficiently and coldly, but Pedro and his family attended, mourning the mother Pedro had just found and lost. At the funeral, Michael and Pedro stood on opposite sides of the grave, two men who had lived each other's lives, shaped more by the families that raised them than by the blood in their veins. The Harris fortune remained with Michael, who continued to build his business empire with the same ruthless efficiency he had always shown. But something had changed in him. His monthly visits to the nursing home to see Barbara had shown him Pedro's genuine kindness. The way the janitor had cared for Barbara with such tenderness, he would never admit it, but it had planted a seed of doubt about what really mattered in life. He began to wonder what kind of man he might have been if he had been raised by Jose and Maria Rodriguez. Pedro continued working at the nursing home, but he was promoted to facilities manager, a position Michael had quietly arranged through anonymous channels. Pedro never knew Michael was behind it, but it allowed him to better provide for his family while continuing to care for the elderly residents who had become like family to him. He would often tell the story of Dorothy's confession to new nurses, not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that their choices, no matter how well-intentioned, could have consequences that rippled through generations. Jose Rodriguez lived another 2 years, long enough to see Pedro's oldest daughter graduate from college, the first in the family to do so. At her graduation, she thanked her grandfather for showing her that family wealth wasn't measured in dollars but in love. Jose died peacefully in his sleep, and at his funeral, Pedro spoke about how his father had shown him what it meant to be a man, how Jose had given him something no amount of money could buy, the knowledge that he was loved unconditionally. The truth about the switched babies never became public. Michael kept his word to stay quiet, protecting his fortune, and Pedro had no interest in fame or lawsuits. But the truth lived on in smaller ways. Pedro would sometimes run into Michael at business events. As Pedro had become a respected community leader, they would nod at each other across crowded rooms. Two strangers who shared DNA, but nothing else. Two men who were proof that nurture shapes us more than nature ever could. Sarah eventually became the head nurse at Willow Creek Nursing Home. She implemented new policies about transparency and ethics. Inspired by Dorothy's confession, she would train new nurses about the importance of respecting families' choices, of never assuming you know what's best for someone else's child. She kept a photo of Dorothy in her office, not to honor her, but to remember the weight of the responsibilities they carried as healthcare workers. Years later, when Sarah was training a new nurse, she was asked about the photo. Sarah would tell a shortened version of the story, ending with this: Dorothy thought she was doing the right thing, giving each baby what she thought they needed, but she forgot that it wasn't her choice to make. Every decision we make in this profession affects real people, real families. We must never forget that we are caretakers, not decision makers. We are witnesses to life's biggest moments, not the authors of them. The new nurse would nod, thinking they understood. But Sarah knew they couldn't really understand until they faced their own moment of temptation, their own opportunity to play God. She hoped they would remember Dorothy's story then, remember that good intentions could pave the road to terrible consequences, that secrets had a way of surfacing even after 50 years, that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would always find its way to the light. The wing of the nursing home where Barbara had lived was eventually renovated and renamed. Pedro had donated money to create a memory care unit with a focus on maintaining family connections. It was called the Unity Wing, and it became a model for other nursing homes. Families were encouraged to visit, to share meals, to be part of their loved ones' care. Pedro would often be there, not as an employee, but as a volunteer, sitting with residents who had no visitors, being the family they needed. Michael Harris's company went public with a record-breaking IPO 5 years after Dorothy's death. In his speech to investors, he mentioned the importance of family values, surprising everyone who knew him. He had never married, never had children, but he had started a foundation that provided scholarships for immigrant families. He never publicly acknowledged why, but those who knew the story understood. It was his way of honoring the family he should have had, the life he had been denied. The last time Pedro and Michael met was at a charity event 10 years after Dorothy's confession. They were both in their 60s now, gray-haired and successful in their own ways. Pedro had built a network of community centers. Michael had built a business empire. They stood together at the bar, two men who had lived each other's lives, and Michael said something unexpected. "I sometimes wonder who I would have been if Dorothy hadn't switched us." Pedro replied, "You would have been exactly who you are. We become who we're meant to be, regardless of where we start." They shook hands that night, not as brothers, but as two men who had shared the strangest of connections. They never saw each other again, but they had found a kind of peace with the truth. Dorothy's crime had shaped their lives in ways she never could have imagined, but ultimately, they had each chosen their own paths. Michael had chosen wealth and power. Pedro had chosen family and community. Neither was wrong. Neither was right. They were simply the products of the families that had raised them, proof that love and values shape us more than blood ever could. Sarah retired as head nurse, 20 years after Dorothy's confession. In her final speech to the staff, she said, "I've learned that nursing homes aren't just places where people come to die. They're places where stories live, where secrets are revealed, where families are sometimes broken, but sometimes healed. Every resident has a story. Every visitor carries secrets, and we are privileged to witness these human dramas. But we must always remember that we are witnesses, not judges, caregivers, not decision makers." The story of Dorothy Mitchell and the switched babies became a legend at Willow Creek Nursing Home, passed down from nurse to nurse, each telling adding their own interpretation. Some saw it as a cautionary tale about playing God, others as a story about the power of nurture over nature, still others as proof that truth always finds a way to surface. But for those who were there, who witnessed Dorothy's confession and its aftermath, it was simply a human story about choices and consequences, about love and family, about the weight of secrets and the power of truth. In the end, Dorothy Mitchell's legacy wasn't the crime she committed, but the lives that continued after her confession. Pedro Rodriguez continued to be the son. Jose and Maria had raised him to be kind, generous, full of love. Michael Harris continued to be the son. Barbara and Richard Harris had shaped ambitious, successful, emotionally distant. The switch had changed nothing and everything. Two families had been forever altered by one woman's decision, but they had survived, adapted, and in their own ways, thrived. The truth about that night in 1968 died with Dorothy, but its effects rippled through generations. A reminder that our choices, no matter how well-intentioned, have consequences we can never fully anticipate. And in room 205 of Willow Creek Nursing Home, where Barbara Harris had spent her final days being loved by the son she had never raised, there was a plaque that Pedro had installed. It simply read, "Family is not defined by blood, but by love." It was Dorothy's confession, transformed into something beautiful, her crime redeemed by the love that had survived despite her betrayal.